Welcome to the second episode of INSA Insights, the only podcast focused on NGO safety and security. Today's guest is Robert Macpherson. Bob was a career infantry officer in the U.S. Marines with service in Vietnam, Iraq, and Somalia. After retiring as a colonel, he enjoyed a second career with the humanitarian organization CARE, where he directed global mitigations for staff in vulnerable populations and led humanitarian response missions worldwide. These efforts often required engaging with foreign governments and the United Nations, but as frequently with non-traditional actors such as the Taliban in Afghanistan, warlords in Sudan and Somalia, local militias, and kidnappers. He is a former board member of INSA, and his debut book is called Stewards of Humanity. Bob, welcome to INSA Insights.
Omri, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see you again.
It's great to see you too. It's been a while, and so besides the catching up part, it's great to see you. You're looking well.
Thank you. I feel good. Thanks, Omri, and so do you. So here we are. All the accolades are passed.
Well, listen. First off, congrats on the new book, Stewards of Humanity. I have my copy right here, which I hope to get signed one of these days. Fantastic book. Tell us why did you write the book?
Well, let's see. How much time do we have?
As long as you want.
Omri, listen, to cut right to the quick. When I first went to Somalia as an infantry officer in the Marines, there's no drama here as I search for the right words. I looked at this NGO community. And you can understand coming at that time from maybe 25 years as a Marine. I looked at these people traveling around with T-shirts, no weapons, trying to deliver food, but up against everything and everybody who stood in their way. And I admit, I scratched my head and thought, there's something wrong with these people. But as I was assigned to work with both the UN and the NGOs to help take all these assets we brought to Somalia, trucks, helicopters, medicine, all these things, and try to integrate with the humanitarian community for the greater good. I began to gain quite a respect for their professionalism and beyond that, their dedication, and I don't want to be too touchy-feely here, but their dedication to humanity. That I remember even then, it struck me. But the book kind of what snapped was I came back from all that, and as a Marine, because of an incident in Somalia and just something that unfolded, I was presented with a medal. And I remember standing there and there's a band and people reading citations and all the rest of those things that go on with it. And I remember even at that time standing there thinking, I come back and I get all these accolades, but there's this whole group of people who probably are lucky to get a handshake when they come back. So the book festered in me for quite some time. And then two things happened. One is I actually had the time to begin to put it together. And the second is that I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. And I found that in writing the book, and I didn't start this way, but I found in writing the book, it became very cathartic to help mitigate some of the pressures with the PTSD. So, and to tighten this up quickly, what I did is over that period of 15 years, I went back to say 16 incidents that really struck me, that were just really hard. And I began to reflect on the people I saw, NGOs, in the midst of all that. And I just chronicled their story. And it's interesting also, people have asked me, did I keep copious notes? And, the truth is, I never took a note in my life out there. Frankly, I didn't have the time. But what I found is that those events and those incidents seemed to have affected me deeply enough that when I shut my eyes and I began writing, the names, the people, all those things just began to flow back out of, without being, too practical here, I guess, out of my subconscious. So yeah, and so I wrote it, and it was quite a journey.
That's great. You, we mentioned you spent 30 years in the Marine Corps. What, if any, are the similarities between the military and the Marines specifically, and the international development, humanitarian aid sectors?
Yeah, Omri, I can answer that. Maybe I'll address two things with that. The first thing I noted is that, and I admit that I had a little bit of an edge inside myself, because you can imagine going from a Marine to being a humanitarian worker, I bumped into a little resistance along the way, along the lines of, what are you doing here? And I pretty much kept that to myself. But what I did find is that the commonality of the dedication of both groups, and over the years, I reminded a couple of people in staff meetings about this, and I summed it up this way: when I felt that their comments about the military were pushing it as far as I was concerned, and I reminded them and said that, the people who join the military, number one, many of them don't have the opportunities that other young people do, as far as the ability and the finances to go to college and things like that. But make no mistake that when they join the military, they consider the hat they're wearing just as white as an NGO who's going out to do work. They lose this thought that all these people join to blow things up and rest of it. In fact, my time in the Marines, I found that the greatest enthusiasm from the women and men I associated with on the Marine Corps side is when they dropped into events where they were there to assist the humanitarian community rather than make war. So that's one side of it. The second side, which I think dovetails nicely with what you sent me about what the focus of this podcast is on. And this is where I believe the military, and you seem to have expanded it to former law enforcement, which I think I can say the same for them. I found that everything we did in preparation for an operation, as far as the task organization of people, the logistics of trying to move the right things to the right place, building the requirements for transportation, the whole thing, in creating an operations plan, was absolutely identical to that last moment. And that last moment where the NGOs were there to assist with life-saving. And unfortunately, in most cases, just because of the nature of the world, the armed forces are there to create peace through war and conflict. But till that event, all those planning episodes were really quite similar. And I felt all along that was something that I had learned in the military. Yeah, it was a good flow for me.
Yeah, and would you say the transition was a difficult one, or was it relatively simple? I mean, I know you talk about that in your book a little bit, but
that's interesting. I have made a joke at my age. Most of my colleagues in the NGO world joined the Peace Corps when I was being drafted to go to war in Vietnam. So, I mean, we came from very different backgrounds. I would say this, Omri. I had to practice leadership by example, and just in many cases, just to be quiet. Never to, I wasn't going to allow somebody to be derogatory to me or my background, and that seldom happened. I mean, I can only think of 2 occasions, but I did feel I had to prove myself, and the only way to do that was to be humble, and also to lead from in front, but to practice those leadership traits. And this is important for people who are thinking about the transition from the military to the NGO community. Regardless if you are an enlisted person or an officer, in virtually all of the armed forces, they will pull you out of your day-to-day duties for periods of 6 weeks to a year, depending on what rank or grade you are. And they will send you to these different level of schools. But the foundation of all of those schools, whether it's the War College as a lieutenant colonel or the NCO Leadership Academy as a junior non-commissioned officer, the foundation for all those things is leadership. They'll train you in a lot of other things, but trust me, going through all of those educational opportunities is this element of leadership. And I truly believe that that's what maybe the biggest thing that a former military person can bring to the humanitarian community. There's a steadiness in there. It doesn't work for everybody. I mean, we're talking about the exceptions who it doesn't work with. But I think the core people, particularly now, with the openness of gender. I mean, when I became involved with risk mitigation at the NGO I was with, everybody looked like me. They were white guys in some form or another who were involved in NGO security. In fact, the reason I hesitated is I think back over that. I think the CEO or the head of your organization, Michael, and I may be wrong, but I think Michael at very early stages would have been one of the few people who did not have a military background associated with NGO risk mitigation. And Michael just is a born leader. And he is one of the few who just was born with that trait. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. In that same line, from the military, what lessons would you pass on to others who want to move from the military space or even law enforcement into the NGO space? We see a lot of people who are retiring from the military, who've served in the military and want to keep on giving back and see NGOs and the humanitarian aid community as a future. But oftentimes they come up against a wall, I think. Well, what advice would you give them? What lessons would you pass on to them?
I think first and foremost is to this goes right back to the police and the military serving, if you will, on active duty. You've got to learn, if you will, the lingo, but it's bigger than just the acronyms and all the rest of it. You have to step back. Once you're on the inside, you have got to step back and learn how it works. And that's similar to, think about somebody who's in the Air Force and gets assigned temporary duty to be a pilot with the Marine Corps aviation or something. One of the first things they need to do, even in the commonality of military terminology, they have to understand how that organization works, both formally, but more important, informally. And I think, again, it's to approach it in a very quiet fashion because they still to this day, I think that there's still going to be this wee bit of skepticism of, will this person really be able to assimilate into our culture. I mean, think about it. I've served in the military at times, well, Somalia. I served with humanitarians who actually were embedded as part of the Marine Corps, not to go out and do the tougher parts, especially as that began to fall apart, but to advise on how to work with the military. Well, their learning curve were just as steep as the reverse. Mm. And then I also said, and I'll keep coming back to this, take those leadership traits that were embedded in the individual in the military and quietly begin to exercise them. Because one thing that I did find in the humanitarian community is that they really valued good leadership. Mm. And it might be a little tougher for them to search for it also, because they don't have all these education and training opportunities that you do in the military. I think also over the years, I've begun to realize that in the very beginning, I used to feel like I was a salesman, not for myself, but particularly in those days when we were just beginning to stand up staff safety and security or risk mitigation. There was this entrenched, why do we have to worry about this stuff? I've been coming and going from these humanitarian emergencies for 25 years, and I don't need anybody to teach me about this or that. And you really had to sell the product. And how did you do that? Again, you were soft about it, but you had to create the network, didn't you? I guess that's what I'm searching for. You had to find your way into the organization and prove your value. It's unfortunate you have to say that, but I think in most civilian, NGO, whatever, military organizations, all of us have to prove our value in the beginning.
Sure. You are, and certainly in my words, you're considered one of the founders of NGO Safety and Security. I would say one of the wise men of NGO Safety and Security.
That's very kind of you. I would say that it was more of a survival than anything else.
Well, in that regard, though, what was it a natural offshoot from your time in the military when you started developing, protocols and procedures that had to do and policies for safety and security in the NGO world?
You asked me about that like a couple days ago in an email, and to be straight up with people listening to this, as I'm sitting here talking, I'm looking out the window at palm trees and the Pacific Ocean because I'm on Oahu with where the majority of my family lives. So I went looking for a particular book. It's a little manual, and the thing was written in like 1974 or 76 or 78. And I just couldn't, I have it at home, but I couldn't find it online. But the Marine Corps came out with this little book called Counterterrorism or Surviving Terrorism or something. And it broke down, it had all these tips, if you will, and protocols for primarily families who are living in more complex environments. And it had these things for what to do with kids and, how your wife should negotiate, going and coming, what to do if you did fall into a situation. And I marveled at this book because this thing couldn't have been 30 or 40 pages long, but somebody who wrote it forecasted the future with this thing. And I remember that was my very first reference source. And I can't even remember how I came by it, but I began to read that particularly for me, it was the Bosnian War. It seemed that, I guess it was, terrorism certainly wasn't a thing, but really, oh my goodness, the kidnappings, the snipers in Sarajevo, the displacement of large groups of people. There were so many things that I was able to begin to reference from that one little book.
Mm.
And then as my experience grew, I could begin to create my own, if you will, just based on experience. And I think this is fair to say, it's fair to say to anyone listening to this, thinking about this transition, because it's true in life, not just in the NGO community. You know, as my confidence began to grow, particularly in those days, going essentially, I marvel at going from Somalia to the Bosnian War to the genocide in Rwanda, all in a period of like 36 months. So, you know, that experience began to give me the confidence, I guess, in saying, you know, I've seen it, I've actually experienced, so now let's get serious about what we do about it.
Yeah. What, staying on the topic of NGO safety and security, do you think that NGOs take safety and security seriously?
Compared to where we were in, say, 1996, 97, when that combination of interaction and now the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, or at that time OFTA, came together and we went down to the Everglades in Florida, they funded a group of about 20 of us to start really coming together and building these protocols. Even then, it was salesmanship. And, you know, one thing happened, and that was that interaction brought together the top, let's say, 8 to 10 CEOs and presidents of the largest North American humanitarian organizations. Yeah, I don't think anyone was there other than Canada and the US, but sat down with them and in essence sold them on, hey, this is serious and it's getting worse. And what happened also at that time, it was getting worse. The kidnappings grew, this rise. At that time, nothing like we began to see in the early 2000s with kidnappings and the murder of people. But it was becoming more and more routine. Consequently, that flipped it. And now watching it, like it in my organization, when we first started NGO Security, for an organization that was in 62 countries and I think had 15,000 people. It was myself and an assistant who worked with me half-time. And now I think in that same organization, the security architecture for it probably runs about 15 people and located around the world. So that's one thing. I also think that the NGOs, the younger NGOs in this day, definitely take it more seriously. And they have to, because they grew up with this. In some form or another. You know, they saw Margaret Hassan killed in Iraq. They saw all the worst atrocities as they were growing up. So they began to realize that they were going to be dropped in the midst of this. There's still some deficiencies, but I think in basic safety and security, they are much better. They're much more aware and much better prepared. And as I say, there's a couple things that I would really like to see expanded. Maybe we can get to that later on.
Yeah, no. Right now, what do you see? That's my next question. Actually, is in that same thing. What do you see that it's still lacking? Where are NGOs still lacking when it comes to safety and security, and where do you think they're excelling?
So I think let's do it in a positive way first. I think they're excelling in what I would call physical safety and security. In other words, how do you protect yourself? How do you protect your organization? How do you mitigate these threats? all those things across the board. Not only, I recall feeling like some of the protocols that I was involved in writing or wrote, it's fine, we're done with it, but I had this bad feeling, and in many cases, they ended up on the shelves of different places. And I'm sure they still do, but across the board, I think more people take it more seriously. And I also think this is the key. The organizational leadership forces them to take it more seriously, which is a great thing. Okay, the flip side of that is that in a big quantum leap, and I was not a fan of it when it started, but in, I think, 2011, this paper was released in the United States called "Can You Get Sued?" And the whole premise of this paper, it was a marvelous paper, was that these two guys, Europeans, had gone and they looked at the laws in all the northern, if you will, nations around the world. I think it dipped into the south a bit, in maybe Brazil, but primarily with European and North Americans. And they looked at the laws for duty of care. And their whole premise was that, the NGO community felt like they were good people doing good things, so they were exempt from this legal requirement of duty of care for staff in complex environments. Not only did they build the premise on that, but they said, okay, for NGOs, this is what duty of care looks like. And, the first part of that title, it was Can You Get Sued? Duty of Care. So the first part of that title, I looked at and was, can you get sued? And I thought, that's all we need in America, more litigation. Until I dug into it and I thought, wow, this is amazing. Okay, that was a quantum leap, because that really caught the attention of most of those mid-size, maybe smaller NGOs in Europe and North America, where they had never been forced to think about that, particularly as the kidnappings began to ramp up, which I got into that quite a bit later in my work in the NGO community of being a negotiator. And I still had to scratch my head when organizations would have people kidnapped, and their level of unpreparedness for that was tragic. But that has begun to change, or did change. But in there, Omri, here's the key. So duty of care became focused on, if you will, I'll flip back to physical security. So we prepare our people, we give them education or training on what to do in an ambush and the rest of it, those type of things. But duty of care for staff safety and security is much broader in the legal requirement and and if you will, not even implied, it's staff well-being. It's not just staff safety and security, it's well-being. And this is what I want to make my point on. When I wrote Stewards, I did not begin to write it towards the epilogue. It came about after if you ever write a book, first of all, don't. But second, after I'm through my 28th edit, all these things become apparent as the publisher begins to ask you more and more questions that really you're not thinking about, but I think it's in the subconscious. So I sat back one day and I thought to myself, okay, of the people I write about, 2 of them were kidnapped, and two of them were murdered. This is just the 16 people I write about. And then it struck me as to the number of people who I didn't write about but who I know personally, who suffered a great deal and still suffer a great deal from substance abuse, from all these things that happened to them in the complexity of where they served. And I'll go all the way back to how we started this. So I'm standing there and I'm getting a medal for something that happened in Somalia. So I fast forward to going to Bosnia, my first humanitarian event. And I fast forward to getting off a helicopter in Sarajevo. So I'm down in Split and I'm waiting for some helicopter to some means to get me into Sarajevo through the UN. And I'm at the bottom of the pecking order as an NGO as far as who gets on this transport. So I notice a British naval helicopter sitting on a runway. So you could do it in these days. So I walk out and I ask these guys, where are you going? We're going to Sarajevo. So I still had a Marine Corps ID card, retired ID card. And I said, hey, can you give me a lift? So they give me a lift. So I'm getting off this helicopter in Sarajevo and a mortar round goes off. And I have to tell you, to lower the drama, this mortar round is like 2,000 meters away. I mean, there's no danger whatsoever, except helicopter pilots know anything like that, they got to get out of there. Mm-hmm. So I hop off this thing, they kick off my bag, and off they go. So I'm walking across this field to go to this tent. And it struck me that for the first time in my life, since I was 17 years of age, that over 30 years have passed. For the very first time in my life, if something happened to me, the Marine Corps was not going to darken the sun with helicopters to come find me. Mm. I really was on my own. So let's think about that. So we have this entire humanitarian community where I just saw a statistic lately that there might be 450,000 professional humanitarians on the planet. But there's easily double that, more than double that, of people who just come and go. All right? So what happens to that person who just graduates from, I'm making all this up, the University of Wisconsin or something, or in your turf, up in George Washington with a degree in international relations, and they get picked up to go off to do some humanitarian work as a very, 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 very junior programming officer, but in a quite complex environment. And they do that. They get, they're done with their 6-month contract and they go home, and that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Anything that comes at them from that point on, they have a problem. And my whole premise, this whole lead up to this thing, is that how many people I know suffer from mental health issues, from death by suicide to substance abuse. Obviously I'm not going to write about that. I wrote about one person who died by suicide in the book. But we have this entire community. And let's circle back to what we're talking about, duty of care. How do the organizations address that? And I will say I've watched this over the years. And look, again, I suffer from complex PTSD. And here's the key to it. The minute I reckoned that, the minute, if you will, I kind of bottomed out and I thought, hey, I've got to do something because this is not going anyplace good. And the thoughts that were beginning to crowd me out were not good thoughts. So what happened? Because I was a veteran, I walked down to the VA, and I have to tell you, Omri, within 48 hours, I was in treatment. VA gets a pretty bad rep on a lot of things, but its treatment for people with PTSD is actually quite exceptional. So look, the world stopped for me. It opened up And all the things that changed everything in my life, and I could get emotional here. It changed everything as to where I was going and where I am now. But again, I hearken back to our community as what happens. What do we have in place that assists people? Because what they see, I'll tell you what, Omri, when I went into the treatment for this PTSD, everybody assumed it came from combat experiences. And trust me, they were pretty dramatic. But as far as the things I saw on a day-to-day basis for months on end, and the total immersion that you and me and other people are experiencing, because no matter where the U.S. military goes, it travels in a bubble. If you will, there's this whole structure around them. Trust me, Omri, where you and I go, you go into these places, and if there's a bubble, I don't see it. I mean, quite often it's a group of how many, 10 at the most, who are trying to make this difference on a day-to-day basis. And you now may not live in exactly the same degree and complexity of the people you're there to assist, but you're living damn close to it. And that takes an effect. And now, once again, more and more and more and more, your colleagues, both national and internationals, are suffering some pretty dramatic consequences of that with death, suicide, disease, all those things, kidnapping. I mean, the kidnappings are crazy. And there was a time, say before 2000, I'm just using that as a demarcation on a factual basis, where kidnappings were more criminal. Now they're more and more, if you will, political, terrorists, and trying to make a statement on the NGO community. I'm running on with this, but obviously it's a pretty big deal to me as far as what's the community do. One last thing with that. Over these years, when I became aware of, through a personal basis, and started looking at mental health in the humanitarian community, NGOs and primarily, I've watched that organizations that did have staff wellness programs and things of that nature, when the numbers have to be crunched, I watched those disappear. So that was one of the first things, or one of the things that eventually disappeared. There's no sense in that. And that's not a bold statement. That is simply a statement of fact.
Yeah.
Staff wellness is the key, but what's left of people after those events is really what's critical, and how do we assist?
Switching gears now to sort of where we are in the world now.
Yeah.
What are some of the geographic areas that you are most concerned about when it comes to NGO safety and security? I mean, you go into depth about your places where you traveled in your book, from Congo to Rwanda to Bosnia. We still have those types of war zones around, but has the dynamic changed? Has the geographic regions changed where you think safety and security of NGO workers is more at risk?
Omri, that's a great question, and let me rephrase that, or let me think I'm processing out loud. Okay, I'm not sure. Certainly, in places like the Congo and let's just use the Congo. That's going to be an ongoing problem for a long time, and that's places in Africa are certainly complex. I'm always amazed that throughout South America that there is this greater degree. I'm not talking about, if you will, central, but the greater degree of stability. But here's where I'd like to lead that. I'm not sure if it's so much a specific geographic area that you can point to. It's the evolution of what is happening right now. And I will admit what just happened a couple of weeks ago in Scotland led me to begin to think about the challenges of climate change, because that's ongoing, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And we're still trying to decide and look at where is that going to be more dramatic. I was astounded when I started thinking about climate change. I looked at something just for the heck of it, Bangladesh. I just happen to know a little bit more about Bangladesh than other places for different reasons. But by 2050, half of the population, or half of the nation state of Bangladesh, is going to be underwater. 2050. That's 30 years, 29 years from now. That will displace 42 million people. Additionally, in that same period of time, the population of this planet will increase by 2 billion people. And that's billion as in B, Bob, billion people. So in the complexity of all that, the competition for natural resources, and we've been hearing about this for a long time, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and certainly for water, crop failures and famine. Let me think. Well, let's go back to Bangladesh. Mass migration of people, and just the extremes of heat and cold. And then fast forward right now to if you were sitting there, you would not consider this a minor event. So I'm not trying to denigrate it. But you've got a couple thousand people being held captive between Belarus and Poland. Okay? Now those, right now, you've got two nation states at odds with each other about what to do with these people. And that, think about 2000. Now think about if all of a sudden that's 1 million. And think about if it's 1 million people trying to cross a border like they have in the past from, say, Somalia going into Kenya. Boy, you want to predict trouble, that would be endless. So, Omri, I'm saying that look at those conditions with climate that begin to evolve. And then you're going to always have fulcrums of power that want to either, Somalia was the first time I ever truly came face to face with starvation. I've seen hungry people, but I have never bumped into starvation. And what made it worse was it was beyond my comprehension to look at warlords who began to use food as a weapon of war, using starvation. I think all of that, unfortunately, before it gets better, we're going to have to go through a trend. And boy, does that sound negative, particularly when you're sitting on Oahu. But the fact is that I think that's where it's going to go. This climate change is going to change it. It's going to get bad.
What do you see as the future of NGO safety and security with that in mind?
All right, to be not to be trite, more is better. But here's one for you. So if I had this magic wand and I could say, okay, here I am, boom, I just waved my magic wand. One of the first things I would do is change that title, because staff safety and security really, really narrows what I believe the NGO community needs. And in preparation for this, I looked up, just for the heck of it, I think on Firefox or Google, I checked it out. First of all, what you and me and our colleagues do, well, certainly staff safety and security is part of it. But what do we really do for an organization? We really do is we deal with crisis mitigation. And if you unfortunately, if you begin to Google that, you will see that maybe on the second page, you will start seeing terminology that when you risk or crisis mitigation, terminology that deals with, say, the humanitarian community. Before that, what you're going to find is that term is most often used in the insurance community. Then it flips down to compliance. Then it flips down to business continuity. And then finally, you'll get into risk mitigation. Well, let me just push that on. I mean, we've never talked about this, but I will suspect that when I bring this up for any people who are involved with risk mitigation in the humanitarian community, I'd like to think there's going to be a lot of head nodding. So, what does your job really involve? Right now, I'm not going to question you, I'm going to answer it for you, but here's what it really involves. And for anybody involved in this profession, actively, or anyone thinking about getting involved in this profession, the physical aspects of safety and security are, if you will, a pillar to risk mitigation. But where that comes into is across the board as we go back, that through your ability and other people's ability to handle crisis and work with crisis, your engagements are far deeper and broader than, if you will, staff safety and security. I'll bring this back to you as an example. Imagine you're in a field on a humanitarian assistance and you've got, 15 people with you, and that's a lot, but just say there's 15. Just by the odds, you're going to have at least 2 of those people who are going to begin to have some problems that have to do with the complexity of the situation. It can run from alcohol. It can run from different types of substance abuse. It can run from traumatic stress. It doesn't even have to be post-traumatic stress. Who do they turn to solve that problem? Yeah, see, you're nodding your head. Who do they turn to solve that problem? Maybe the team leader, but who's the team leader most often turn to? Omri, we got a problem with, he's drinking all the time. He is aggressive. He's doing this or that. You need to solve this. So the whole dynamic of working with the individual one-on-one, or being able to get that person out of there, get that person get help. Here's the other one. God forbid, who do they turn to when a woman is sexually assaulted in the midst of these things? Who does it? You do it. And you can begin to extrapolate all of those different events that are quite far removed from the basic elements of, well, here's how to handle yourself in an ambush. Okay, I'm not denigrating it. It's very important, but it's so much broader. And that's where I'm saying that in this community, you need to take the people who, like you, who are involved in those things, and begin not just for the credibility, if you will, Omri works in global risk mitigation for this organization, but it's a thought process, isn't it? It takes what you do on a day-to-day basis and begins to expand it into not a wishful world, but into the realities of what you do. And I will push it further. It takes it into the realities of what you can design your engagement and your shop, if you will. The whole aspect of staff wellness became really important because, if you will, they worked within the structure of crisis mitigation or risk mitigation for the organization. So we were joined at the hips to be able to broaden our approach to those things. So yeah, where does the future go? I just said it in probably took too long, but I think we need to broaden how we view the risk mitigation officer, if you will, in the NGO community.
With that in mind, what advice do you have for those who are considering a career in the NGO security space?
Well, the first thing to get into it in a positive way is that it will be, if you make that transition, and you truly make that transition, not in a physical fashion, but in an emotional, in a professional, if you really make that transition, I seldom say things like this. I will guarantee you, as you look back in the years of your life, this will be the most fulfilling period you will ever have. And the reason is really simple. In most organizations where we go in this day and age, any organization, what you do is generally on a grander scope. For you personally, but your engagement is you're part of an achievement. You're part of a goal. You're part of building something. And you contribute, okay? I have found as a humanitarian that the places I went, it was that everything I did counted. Everything. Mm-hmm. From a group of 5 of us in East Timor one time or another after they had a really bad situation there, down to Banda Aceh for the tsunami that hit there, through all these different complexities in different places with wars and conflicts. You're involved right in the middle of people who are desperate for help. And that what you did by getting food and what you did by helping with medicine or just moving people or just getting one person from point A to point B to a physician with MSF to get them help. All those things counted. And as I look back on them, there was a sense of, it was broader than just a contribution. It was broader than, it was for the first time in my life, I felt, I really did something here. And trust me, it was frustrating because on the flip side of that, there is never enough in the complexity of those environments. No matter how hard you try in the greater context of your organization tied in with 50 other humanitarian organizations, and you're in a famine, no matter how hard you try, there's never enough food. There's never enough water, because as you try to say, okay, we got enough now to feed 50,000 people. Trust me, another 10,000 just showed up in the past 24 hours. Mm-hmm. So that you live with that. But on the other hand, think about it. Not many people on this planet can say, by gosh, I went there, I did something, and it helped. And that help doesn't always have to be actually moving the stuff. It can be the national staff member who's the truck driver and the rest of it. But bringing all those things together, and again, I'm looking back on a lot of that now, particularly at my age. Those are the things, that's the thing that stood out for me, is that, yeah, I hope I answered that question.
You did. Bob Macpherson, thank you for being a guest on INSA Insights. Really appreciate your time.
I appreciated you letting me run on like this, Omri, and for everybody who listens to this, thank you. I appreciate being here. INSA is a great organization. I watched it grow from an idea of just a couple of my colleagues to its contribution, and that's just not nice talk. What you all are doing is remarkable, and so I thank you for that. Okay.
Thank you to the Robert McPherson Fellowship for its generous support and donation, helping to make these podcasts possible.